June 1940. France lay defeated, its armies shattered, its leaders humiliated, its people in shock. Out of the ashes of surrender rose a man from another war, Marshal Philippe Pétain, the hero of Verdun. He promised salvation, order, and dignity. But what he offered was submission. In the spa town of Vichy, far from the occupied north, a new government took shape, one that would serve, not resist, the German Reich. Pétain's voice crackled over the radio. "It is with a heavy heart that I tell you we must cease fighting." For millions of Frenchmen, those words ended not just a war, but an era. The Republic died in silence. The old ideals of liberty, equality, fraternity were replaced by new ones: work, family, fatherland. The Vichy regime was born not from conquest, but from fear. And in its polished offices, beneath portraits of Pétain and swastikas, began one of the darkest chapters of France's history: collaboration dressed as patriotism. Vichy claimed to defend France's honor by cooperating with the occupier. In truth, it became Berlin's puppet. Hitler did not need to conquer southern France. Pétain and his ministers did it for him. Marshal Pétain appointed Pierre Laval, a cunning politician with no moral compass, as his right hand. Laval believed collaboration was the key to survival. He opened French factories to the German war machine, sent food and resources north, while French families starved. German officers attended cabinet meetings. Nazi officials dictated laws. Every word printed, every radio broadcast, every play performed had to please Berlin. Even the police swore loyalty not to France, but to the new order. To the world, Vichy posed as neutral. In reality, it enforced occupation with a French face. The regime's greatest weapon was not force, it was obedience. The true horror of Vichy lay not in what it suffered, but in what it did. Under Pétain's signature, anti-Jewish statutes were passed, before the Germans even asked. Jews were banned from public life, expelled from schools, stripped of their rights as citizens of France. The milice, Vichy's paramilitary police, hunted resistance fighters and deported thousands to death camps. French trains, driven by French conductors, carried men, women, and children east toward Auschwitz. Propaganda filled the airwaves, painting collaboration as virtue and resistance as treason. Posters showed smiling families under the marshal's protection, while in the shadows, neighbors betrayed neighbors for a ration card or a favor. France had not been divided by invasion. It had been divided by choice, and that choice would stain its conscience for generations. To maintain control, Vichy built a cult, not of God, but of the Marshal himself. His portrait hung in every classroom. Children began their day reciting prayers for Pétain, father of the nation. His speeches were broadcast daily, calm and paternal, promising protection in exchange for loyalty. The motto, "Work, Family, Fatherland," replaced the Republic's ideals. The Church, eager to regain its influence, lent its blessing. Statues of Marianne, the symbol of liberty, were removed, replaced by crucifixes and the Marshal's face. For many, this illusion of order was comforting. After the chaos of defeat, obedience felt safer than defiance. But behind the slogans lay decay, moral, spiritual, national. France had become its own prison, and the man who once stood for courage now stood for capitulation. Not all of France bowed. In secret rooms, basements, and forests, another France was being born, one that refused to kneel. Journalists printed forbidden newspapers. Students distributed leaflets denouncing Vichy's lies. Messengers carried coded notes through checkpoints, risking death for a single word: liberté. General Charles de Gaulle, exiled in London, became their voice. His broadcasts over the BBC thundered across occupied Europe. France has lost a battle, but France has not lost the war. To the collaborators, he was a traitor. To the people, he was hope. Every act of defiance, every poster torn down, every radio built in secret, was a spark in the dark. Vichy could command the laws of France, but not the spirit of its people. The Vichy Regime perfected obedience. Every aspect of life, work, speech, even thought, was subject to control. Newspapers printed government propaganda. Film reels before every movie praised the Marshal. Music was censored. Books by Jewish or degenerate authors vanished from shelves. Informants flourished. A careless joke, an overheard remark, a radio dial set to London, all could lead to arrest. The Gestapo handled torture. The French police handled everything else. Curfews tightened, food rations dwindled, and hope thinned like the bread on the table. And yet, millions complied, not out of conviction, but fatigue. The greatest victory of Vichy was not military, but psychological. It convinced a nation that survival was safer than freedom. No generation was more vulnerable to Vichy's influence than the children. Schools became factories of ideology. Teachers were ordered to instill loyalty to the regime and contempt for foreigners, Jews, and traitors. Textbooks glorified obedience and hard work. The young learned to salute portraits of Pétain, their grandfather. Summer camps trained boys for labor and discipline, girls for motherhood and silence. Scouts sang songs about renewal and purity. For a child in 1942, collaboration was not a crime. It was patriotism. But some teachers refused. They hid banned books, taught the truth in whispers, or vanished into the resistance. Years later, those children would remember the first lie they ever heard came from their own classroom. Vichy's greatest crime was not only betrayal, it was the corruption of innocence. Then came the moment that defined France's shame. At dawn on July 16, 1942, the Verdun roundup began. French police, not Germans, surrounded Jewish homes in Paris. They arrested more than 13,000 men, women, and children, herding them into the winter velodrome. The air was suffocating, the floor covered in filth. No food, no water, no mercy. After 5 days, they were loaded into cattle cars and sent to Auschwitz. Fewer than 100 would return. The operation was planned, executed, and celebrated by Vichy officials. Marshal Pétain remained silent. Pierre Laval justified it. Not all the Jews will be deported, only the foreign ones. But the line between foreign and French blurred quickly. The horror of the Verdun was not imposed by Hitler. It was carried out by French hands, and it would haunt France for generations. By 1943, the mask of dignity had slipped. The war turned against Germany. The Allies advanced in North Africa, and France's colonies began to switch allegiance to free France. Vichy's control faltered. Laval begged Berlin for support, while Pétain retreated into silence, a frail old man surrounded by fear and delusion. The resistance grew bolder. Railway workers sabotaged trains. Factories slowed production. Underground papers called the regime the shame of the nation. German reprisals were brutal, but could not extinguish the will to fight. The illusion of neutral France shattered. Vichy was no longer a government. It was a ghost clinging to power, despised by the people it claimed to protect. In the summer of 1944, the walls finally closed in. As Allied troops landed in Normandy, the resistance struck from within. Bridges exploded, trains derailed. The once obedient countryside erupted in chaos. Vichy's ministers fled south, carrying suitcases of stolen gold and forged papers. Pétain, frail and forgotten, watched from his window as the Reich crumbled. He had once promised to save France. Now, he could not even save himself. When Paris rose in revolt that August, the tricolor returned to the sky. The collaborators who had smiled beside German officers vanished into the crowd or faced the mob's fury. The era of Vichy was over. Its crimes would echo for decades, but its power, built on fear and obedience, died the moment France remembered how to say no. As Allied forces advanced through France, the regime collapsed in slow motion. The German army no longer needed its puppet, and the French no longer obeyed it. Pierre Laval fled, clutching government records and gold. Pétain, old and broken, was taken by the Germans to Sigmaringen, a bizarre exile where the last remnants of Vichy pretended to rule a country that no longer existed. In the empty streets of Vichy, people tore down portraits of the Marshal. The tricolor rose again over town halls, once draped with swastikas. Across France, liberation came not just from Allied troops, but from conscience, a collective awakening after 4 years of silence. When Paris was freed, the bells of Notre Dame rang, not just for victory, but for redemption. The shadow of collaboration was lifting, but its scars would never fade. In the months after liberation, France turned its anger inward. The epuration, the purge, swept the nation. Thousands of collaborators were arrested, tried, or executed. Women accused of sleeping with German soldiers were paraded through the streets, their heads shaved in humiliation. Others faced firing squads. Some trials were fair, many were not. The thirst for justice often blurred with revenge. Marshal Pétain was captured and brought to Paris. His trial in 1945 was broadcast across the nation. Once hailed as the savior of France, he now stood frail, whispering that he had only sought to protect his people. The court sentenced him to death, but Charles de Gaulle, now leader of Free France, commuted it to life imprisonment. He said, "You do not execute the hero of Verdun, you bury him with his shame." After the war, France tried to move forward, but the ghosts of Vichy lingered. For decades, the nation spoke little of its collaboration. History books called it the time of trouble. Politicians avoided the word guilt. The myth of a nation of resistors prevailed. Convenient, comforting, false. But truth has its own patience. In the 1970s and 1980s, trials of former officials like Klaus Barbie, Paul Touvier, and Maurice Papon reopened old wounds. Survivors of deportations testified. The world learned that France's betrayal had not been an accident of history. It had been a choice made by men in suits, signed in ink, and carried out in silence. Vichy was no longer just a chapter. It was a mirror. The Vichy regime remains one of history's most haunting lessons, how fear can disguise itself as patriotism, how obedience can destroy freedom, and how even a nation of culture and reason can surrender its conscience. France emerged from the war wounded, but wiser. The new republic rebuilt not only its cities, but its ideals. De Gaulle's France would become a nation defined by defiance, not submission. But the question remained, whispered through generations, how could it happen here? The answer lies not in armies or politics, but in the choices of ordinary people, those who looked away and those who refused to. The ruins of war gave way to rebirth. In the years that followed, France reclaimed its soul through remembrance, not denial. Monuments rose to the resistance, museums to the victims, and silence gave way to truth. In 1995, President Jacques Chirac finally broke the last taboo, acknowledging France's role in the Holocaust. Yes, the criminal folly of the occupier was assisted by the French state. With that, the circle closed. The France that once collaborated had finally confessed, and in doing so, reclaimed its honor. From the ashes of shame rose a deeper patriotism, one built not on illusion, but on memory. Because nations, like people, are not defined by how they fall, but by how they rise again.